considers it illusory. And to quote, the bottom line is that the progressive reform of the EU and EU is not only impossible in practical terms, but also undesirable in popular democratic terms. Could you elaborate on this idea and why do you think it's the case?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so before I answer you, I just want to comment on a few things that were said, and then I will answer you. So on the question, so the economic problems, I mean, Zoltan gave a perfect, I think, overview of what the economic problems of the Eurozone are. It makes no sense to say whether the Eurozone is a good or bad currency in purely economic terms. It's worked fairly well for some countries, or for the capitalists within that country. But even for, I mean, if you look at Germany, it has a very low level of unemployment, even though a lot of those jobs are poorly paid, precarious jobs, but low levels of unemployment. The same goes for a number of countries that are part of the sort of German bloc or German sort of wider supply chain, which also includes a number of Eastern countries. They all enjoy fairly low levels of unemployment and even decent levels of growth. Nothing spectacular, but they're doing okay. So that's one bloc, the sort of German bloc, and then you have the periphery bloc, and particularly the Mediterranean bloc, which instead has fared disastrously, as has been mentioned. I mean, appalling unemployment levels, appalling poverty levels. In many cases, unemployment, poverty, and GDP growth levels that have regressed to levels that were lower than they were before entering the Eurozone. Greece is a sort of the quintessential example of this. Greece today has an average unemployment rate of about 20%, as I said, and that's the highest unemployment rate that Greece has had. I've looked at the data that goes as back as the 1960s, and you can't find a time in Greek history where unemployment has been this high. So, as a direct result of its Eurozone membership, Greece today has the highest unemployment rate that it's ever had in 50 years. So that's one point. So the question really is, the Eurozone is tailored around a certain economic model, the German export-led low inflation model. So if you're if you have that model already in place, or if you're part of the German supply chain, and so you're also a kind of export-led country because you sell parts to Germany for cars and so on, you can survive within the Eurozone. The problem is, the real problem is for countries that have a radically different economic model, in particular the countries of the periphery, which historically have always been more internal demand-led economies, higher inflation economies, and so on. So the question is, so if a country is, or if the citizens of a country are wondering whether their country should enter the Eurozone or not, that's obviously, the first thing to look at. What's the economic structure of our economy, and is our economy compatible with the Eurozone's architecture? And I don't know enough about Hungary to say whether that is the case or not. So that's one issue, the economics. But I think it's the politics of the Eurozone and of the EU are as, if not more important than the economic issues. So I completely agree with Professor Rona's assessment of what neoliberalism is. It's a system in which the state essentially becomes, the instrument of capital rather than regulating the labor-capital conflict. And I think the EU and the Eurozone particularly are a perfect example of this. So I'd like to add a few elements of reflection on the EU. So it's been said that, essentially the EU, and particularly the Eurozone, is a system in which national elites have ceded to supranational institutions a whole series of tools of intervention that they previously had. Currency management, monetary policy, fiscal policy, to a large degree, and so on. So, of course, one may ask him or herself, why would they do this? Why would national elites voluntarily give up, what were, their some of their most essential prerogatives as, the political managers of a nation? It doesn't seem to make much sense at first. And of course, there are a number of reasons why they did this. But there's one, I think, element that one should reflect on, and that is that by ceding power to supranational institutions, you effectively, national elites form national, I would say, economic political elites. In formal terms, they lose power because they can't resort to deficits anymore. I mean, they really have way fewer powers, even to sort of manage political consensus in their countries. But they gain power in another way, and that is that by having the ability to constantly displace the responsibility for unpopular political choices onto international institutions, external institutions, such as the ECB, the European Commission, and so on, is a very powerful tool for all the various national economic political elites themselves to implement policies that they have always wanted to implement, but would have had a much harder time implementing had they been politically responsible for their decisions. I think this is an aspect of how the Eurozone and the European Union works that is often underplayed, but I think it's a crucial aspect of why national elites were willing to cede these powers, is that in a way they gained powers. So if you look at at Italy, for example, by ceding certain powers, by joining the Eurozone, national elites, economic elites, capital, was able to implement policies that would have been almost impossible to implement in political terms outside of the Eurozone. Because of now all they have to do is, if unemployment goes up or whatever, they can simply say it's not our fault. It's the ECB's fault. It's the European Commission's fault. Or simply Europe demands this. Now in Italy, the phrase "ce lo chiede l'Europa," which means Europe demands this, or Europe is asking for this, is so common. It's actually it's entered our pop culture. People joke about it. I don't want to do this, but Europe is asking me to do it. To say how much, how much national elites have used this argument to implement highly antisocial policies. So I think this is one element. In a way, the EMU, the Eurozone, can be considered a very powerful tool in the hands of all national capitals to implement policies that they have always wanted to implement. So that's one point. Then there's another point, and that is that not all states are the same. Not all states are equal. Some states are more equal than others. There's a clear hierarchical relationship of states within the Eurozone. So it's no secret that Germany has a great is not only Europe's economic powerhouse, but as a result of this also yields a great political power in the EU for a number of reasons, which we won't go into details, but let's take that as a fact that Germany is the sort of a dominating power within the Eurozone and the EMU. And in this sense, the Eurozone is also a very powerful tool to implement policies on countries that dare to defy this sort of economic political status quo. So Zoltan was mentioning the Greek example. I mean, I think I'll go over it again just because it merits reflection. So you have a government that's elected, Syriza, center-left government that's elected on a sort of anti-austerity platform, tries to bring an alternative policy program to the European institutions to try to at least soften the blow of austerity and so on. European institutions, completely refused to even consider Greece's proposals, and at the height of the negotiations, the ECB, the European Central Bank, in a purely political decision, a decision that was not motivated by any financial or monetary considerations, in a purely political decision, decides to shut down the Greek banking system as a way to put pressure on the Greek government and to essentially force it to sign the third bailout, and the new austerity measures that were associated with it. And I think this is really telling of what it means, especially for a weak country, a relatively weak country, to join the Eurozone. It does essentially mean that you are reverting yourself to a kind of neo-colonial status. You're becoming a kind of financial colony of external institutions which can literally impose policies on you, not on your government, but even on the citizens, which of course have elected that government on a certain program. What happened in Greece is that, a central bank used its currency issuing powers to essentially force an elected democratic government to accept the policies that the central bank and more in general the European institutions believed that Greece should follow. Now just reflect a minute on what this means in democratic terms. I mean, it's not, the problem with the European Central Bank is not just that it's only focused on low inflation and so on, which is a problem, is that it's a central bank unlike any other central bank in the world. It would be unthinkable for any normal central bank to dare to openly defy a government, an elected government, and to even try to remove that government. It would be unthinkable for any normal central bank to do that. And instead that happens, I would say, quite regularly in the Eurozone. Greece is the most obvious example, but in my country we had a similar episode. It's less clear-cut, there's still debates about what exactly happened in 2011 when Silvio Berlusconi was forced to resign and the technocratic government of Mario Monti, former Goldman Sachs man, was brought in. But there's ample evidence, and quite high-level politicians that were in power at the time have come out and said that there essentially was a kind of European conspiracy to use the ECB to put pressure on the Italian government. The message being, if you Silvio Berlusconi don't resign, the ECB is going to stop intervening to support Italian bond prices and Italian banks. There's disagreements about whether this exactly happened or not but I think there's sufficient evidence to show that this was the case. We have the example of Ireland, 2010, where leaked letters have shown that the ECB and the European Commission basically told the Irish government, either you bail out your banks or we're going to stop supporting your government debt. So there's ample evidence of how essentially the Eurozone, of how the Eurozone essentially means that governments, do essentially revert to a kind of neo-colonial status. So I think the question there is, for any country, wondering whether they should join the Eurozone or not, look at the economic aspects, but look also at the political democratic aspects. You would be entering a system in which effectively, today you think it might be in your interest, tomorrow, for whatever reason, you decide you want to change your policies, you want to break with the European policy status quo, and you would effectively be unable to do it. So your democratic rights would be severely restricted, because you could even elect a government in power that was in favor of a different policy than the one proposed by the European Union and European Monetary Union, but chances are you would have no hope of implementing that program, and your government might even be removed through financial blackmail or pressured into accepting whatever policy Europe proposal through financial blackmail. And I know it sounds like some kind of sci-fi story, some kind of Le Carré book, but these are all things that have effectively happened in the past few years in the European Union. I'm not making anything up. So I think there's economic questions to think upon, but even more important political questions to reflect upon. And so this brings me to your question, can the Eurozone be reformed in a way? So reform of the Eurozone, so making the Eurozone sustainable would mean, from my point of view, would mean making it economically sustainable, but also politically sustainable. So to make it economically sustainable, the Eurozone would effectively have to be transformed into a kind of, a normal federal political union, like, the United States, Australia, or whatever. And that would require a central government, a central treasury with the ability to deficit spend, for example, with the support of the ECB. And not simply to have a small pot of money that it can give around, but it should have the ability to spend in deficit with the ECB directly supporting, this future European government. That's what all normal federations do. you would have to have permanent, I would say semi-permanent, fiscal transfers between countries and regions. I think when the Germans say that they're afraid that a fiscal and political union would bring about permanent fiscal transfers between countries and regions, they're right. I think given the structural differences between countries, that is true. You would effectively have regions and countries that are permanently in surplus, that have an external surplus, and countries that have a sort of almost permanent, I would say, structural deficit. And that is exactly what happens even in the United States. In the United States, you more or less have states that are permanently in deficit and states that are permanently in surplus. So there's permanent fiscal transfers constantly at play within any fiscal union, any real federation. And you would need a whole set of other things. I mean, tax harmonization, labor market harmonization, a whole set of things. And the question is, how realistic is it to expect Germany to accept this? We're talking of a reform that, sort of in very basic terms, sort of Keynesian reform of the Eurozone, which would effectively be, in complete contradiction with Germany's economic model. And so, the question is, why should Germany ever accept that kind of reform? But more in general, even if you think about what that would require purely in technical terms, you would need treaty change. You would have to change the treaties for this kind of radical institutional reform of the European Union and Eurozone. Changing the treaties essentially, means unanimity of all member states. So you would have to convince all member states that this is the kind of reform that they should all support. So I think it's not hard to see why, people like me and others increasingly believe that, making the Eurozone even just economically sustainable is unrealistic. And, a number of commentators share, and especially people who know Germany and know how Germans think, they will tell you, all German commentators will tell you, it's almost impossible for Germany to accept, a kind of Keynesian radical reform of the Eurozone. That's one point. And then I say, even if that were possible, would it be desirable? Because then you have the issue, okay, we've created a Eurozone government, but how do you make that government democratically accountable? How do you create a government where citizens accept essentially voting once every 4 years, let's say, for the European Parliament, and accepting that is the sovereign entity, and that the decisions that institution makes, have to be accepted as, the sort of common will of the European people. I find that, and setting aside a whole set of other problems, I find that very unlikely. I think it's very hard to imagine that in the real future, the majority of European citizens will come to accept the European Parliament as the main sovereign sort of legislative body, and would accept the European Parliament's decisions as legitimate. And so I think, so from my point of view, the conditions just don't exist to make the Eurozone sustainable, neither in economic terms or in political terms. Now, I know a lot of people disagree, but I think at least maybe we should give ourselves a time frame. Like, how much time do we allow ourselves for these reforms to take place before we seriously start taking into consideration other options? I think then maybe that's a point where maybe we can all, people who believe that reform is possible and people that don't believe it is possible can maybe find some agreement. Okay, can we at least agree on a time frame? So let's say, let's give ourselves X, years, to make this happen. After that, we all seriously start to take into consideration, other options, including a reversion to national currencies for some countries. I think we need to be having this debate. I mean, the whole issue of return to national currencies, which does pose huge technical and political difficulties, given the current situation for a number of countries, I think cannot be evaded. It is an option that has to be taken into consideration in the context of a Eurozone that appears increasingly unreformable.
Professor Rona, you're known to be one of the most prominent advocates for a wage union in the European Union here in Hungary. And considering that, could you reflect